The Venture Brothers is, as just about any video essay will tell you, about failure at its core. Later seasons stray away from this, allowing Dr. Venture and the Monarch to have victories. But in its roots, it's about a failure of a super scientist. I don't really want to talk about the theme of failure, though. Many people, including the original authors, have tackled it better than I could already. So instead, I'm going to talk about Brickleberry. Actually, first I'm going to talk about Smiling Friends. Smiling Friends is an adult animated comedy that was a breakout success for Adult Swim. Created by Newground animators, or for you youngins, YouTube animators, it's not quite like anything the channel had shown before. And that's saying something because Adult Swim is one of the biggest spaghetti at the wall throwers out there. In a podcast, one of the creators for Smiling Friends is asked about the success of the show. Zach Hadel gives the following advice.
I think it is and this is something I would definitely advise to people if you're an animator or an artist. This has really helped me, is try as much as you can to not be influenced by stuff of the same genre.
It's hard to pull a good soundbite with a summary of this point because he's just rambling. But he's saying that if all your inspirations are too close to your goal, you end up with genre incest. If your inspiration is Family Guy, South Park, The Simpsons, and that's it, then you get something that feels like it's been bred too hard for one or two qualities, and now it can't breathe and gets constant yeast infections in its eyeballs. If your inspiration is your goal, you end up with Brickleberry or any of its identical feeling shows. Now, I hadn't seen Brickleberry before this video, and I thought I should probably watch it so I can get specific details. But then I couldn't finish the first episode, so I'm going to have to just assume that my original hunch of it being a woodsy Family Guy is correct. Sorry, I'm not watching something I don't want to watch, because I see Quentin reviews as a cautionary tale. This isn't to say you should be completely blind to what you're trying to do. If you are illiterate in your genre, you end up with something like Disenchantment. Now, I like Disenchantment enough, I've seen its first 2 seasons, but especially in the first few episodes, it feels like the writers are really unaware of fantasy and its tropes. Yes, it's technically a fantasy setting, but it's not really a fantasy story. The jokes are mostly historical or grounded in nature.
You've seen the future in Futurama. You've seen the present in Springfield. So, what's the obvious third move? The past, of course.
The stepmom is a druggie, medicine sucked back then, and the clergy is constantly changing what their religion and what its rules are. Its fantasy setting feels almost wasted on it. Now, something like Disenchantment can survive this genre illiteracy because it has other cool elements. Bean and Lucy grow into characters, plot twists are properly set up, and I was genuinely excited to continue this story. Not every major flaw kills a show, after all. A better example of genre illiteracy is Futurama. No, I'm sorry, that show is actually extremely science fiction literate. But there's one scene in one of its movies, Bender's Game, that is a perfect example of your goal and interests being unrelated. In this, Bender tries to join a D&D game DM'd by Qbert. This movie decides it wants to be part fantasy, but it's kinda clear that while the writers are tangentially aware of D&D, they don't actually play it themselves. At the start of the game, Bender casts Darkness and the rest of the team cheers. Anyone that has ever played with a player that knows Darkness would immediately go, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking about." Because Darkness is a famously bad spell as it makes everyone, including the players, miss all of their attacks. And since D&D only lets you attack once per turn by default, Darkness makes it feel like your teammate has decided you're not allowed to play the game until someone casts a light spell. Coincidentally, another example of your inspiration being too close to the goal is Futurama's The Scary Door. The Scary Door is a Twilight Zone parody, and at first they sound like real Twilight Zone episodes but compressed so that the twists are comical instead of tense. Later though, the Scary Door shorts become just random stuff happening. The best guess I have for this is that the new writing team has not actually seen the original Twilight Zone, or at least didn't really like it, but they had seen the previous Scary Doors. It's a reference to something that, if you don't get it, it's fine, but if you do get it, it actually makes your enjoyment of the piece worse. That's not a position you want to be in. In fact, that's the opposite of the position you want to be in. It's really interesting that this happens with Futurama too, because the show is a great example of understanding its roots. It knows sci-fi, it knows what it's riffing on. Partway through the first season, the show really gets its footing somewhere between animated sitcom and sci-fi comedy, and while it falls off that horse pretty often, its best moments are when it's straddling this line. The episode where everyone gets Freaky Friday'd is amazing, and the basis of that episode is a mathematical theorem that did not exist prior to this show. Yes, if you are a mathematician, you can now both regularly cite the Unabomber and Futurama, and you'd be correct to do so. If you've never seen Futurama, that might seem intimidating to you, that one of its episodes is literally about an at-the-time unproven mathematical function. But trust me, I'm a dumb idiot that still doesn't understand this theorem, and I immensely enjoyed this episode. That's how a reference is supposed to be. Someone who doesn't get it should not feel like they're missing out, and someone who does get it should feel happier to get it. So, now that we've done our homework, let's get into the Venture Brothers. The Venture Brothers' thematic roots are in failure, which is especially true in the first 3 seasons, but the show itself is anything but. It got 7 seasons before its cancellation, and it has a movie on the way with no seasonal rot because all but 1 episode were written by the same 2 guys. Not many shows can say this. Long-lasting shows tend to cycle out talent, which leads to character flanderization. But, if anything, the Venture Brothers gets flanderized backwards. Let's take its initial premise. The Venture Brothers is ultimately the answer to the question, what if Saturday morning cartoons existed in a grounded reality? What would being constantly thrust into danger and trusted to make adult decisions as a child do to you as you age out of it? We see these questions from 2 points of view. The boys, who are yet to outgrow their traveled yet ignorant identities as boy adventurers, and Dr. Venture, who has been chewed up and spat out by the system already. The show is very genre-aware, going so far as to change the animation style during some flashbacks to perfectly imitate the styles of the shows they are parodying. It knows and plays on the tropes of boy adventures, putting them in new contexts and driving them into real-world consequence. It also pretty quickly introduces superhero parody, where it then recontextualizes what a hero and a villain is, who plays by the rules, and who enforces those rules.
Someone points a gun at you, you call the police. If a bunch of guys are pointing guns at you, you call SWAT. If they're in spandex and pointing a super laser at you, you call the OSI. And if they're dressed regular and they're pointing a super laser at your daughter, that's when you call Sphinx.
But that's not all they consumed. If it was, the show would be really stupid. It would be like half of the Star Wars parodies out there where the characters are all assigned a Star Wars character. They walk through the exact plot of one of the Star Wars movies, but one of them is peeing on the set, and the other one of the characters is making constant meta-commentary about how the original work sucks, actually. That's not fun to watch. The closest this show gets to that is the B-plot in the Venturstein episode, where the Scooby-Doo gang is real, but they're serial killers. I didn't care much for that plot, but it's not so bad that I refuse to watch it. This show isn't a rehash of the boy adventure genre. It's a diverse and artistic reconstruction of it. If you've never seen Johnny Quest, if you don't get a single damn reference in this show or know what the fuck Dr. Girlfriend is talking about when she says Depeche Mode, you will still enjoy this show, and I know this because I have not watched a single thing the show references. By the time I started watching TV, cartoons were already hard into the comedy era, and action was limited to Danny Phantom and a few others. Any reference in the show is completely lost to me, and I still loved it. Many people I talk to get every dumb reference, from the Diamond Dogs to... At this point I don't know what part of the show isn't a reference to something, and they also love the show. Both of our perspectives get a good experience. Anyway, let's talk about Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls is a Disney cartoon about it's about the modern equivalent of a boy adventure. The genre has heavily changed over time to have more parental guidance. Steven Universe gets the gems and Dipper gets Grunkle Stan. These kids have flawed but helpful adults in their life, both complicating things and holding their hands through it all. I think it's overall a good show, but I have some qualms with it that make it hard to rewatch. For instance, it has that extreme formulaic nature where you could drop me in a random part of an episode I had never seen before, and within 30 seconds I could tell you how much time was left in that episode, probably about 80% of the time, purely because I recognized which part of the A or B plot we were in, where it was tying together, and the way Disney has hyper-perfected its tension arc. This isn't a jab at staunch 3-act structures, it's my favorite structure type. But a lot of Disney shows in particular suffer from being predictable, if not the plot, then at least how you're about to feel. But another flaw of Gravity Falls is a little more relevant to this section, and it's Grinda. Grinda is a character whose sole character trait is that she sounds like a grown man, and is masculine and really strong. And the only boy that would like her are weirdo Germans. Gravity Falls has a few of these really mean-spirited characters like Thompson, who exists to get hazed, but Grinda is my focus because she has a counterpart in the Venture Brothers. Dr. Girlfriend's first appearance in the Venture Brothers is the Flash animated pilot episode. Most people consider the traditionally animated Mexico episode the first, but the pilot aired first. Dr. Girlfriend is dating the Monarch. She's his number 2 both in bed and as a henchman. Woman. The Monarch was, at this point, never intended to be a permanent villain, let alone probably the second most character in the series. Second most character. Let alone probably the second most important character in the series. So when they were trying to decide on who would voice her, one of the writers said, "Hey, what if I just did my Harvey Fierstein impression?" And so, Dr. Girlfriend for the rest of the series has a masculine voice, far more masculine than any other man on the show or even Grinda. But it's, weirdly, not mean-spirited. Yes, the joke is that she's this beautiful, talented woman who makes a weird first impression because of her voice.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes, I belong in here. I just have a deep voice.
Okay, can I ask you another one?
But it's grounded. The show doesn't punish her for having a deep voice, even if other characters do. Brock genuinely believing she's had an experimental baboon uterus surgery. I'm a man with a very feminine voice and apparently hands. It would be impossible to have a cartoon character that looks like me and sounds like me without it coming off as a joke that this tiny-ass little man sounds like a teenage girl. But if I had to trust the Gravity Falls crew or the Venture Brothers crew to write that character, I would absolutely throw it to the Venture Brothers. Because Grinda, despite being relatively happy and having friends and eventually a weird German boyfriend, the show doesn't see her as a girl. They see her as a grown man, parroting as a girl that only a foreigner can love. Dr. Girlfriend is a woman, hard line, no arguing. She gets to be a woman who happens to have a deep voice. She is loved by the Monarch. She is desired by Phantom Limb. She gets to have woman-on-woman talks the moment the show realizes it can write more than one woman per episode, and yes, she does get encountered randomly in public bathrooms because, yeah, that's what happens when you have mixed-sex traits. Grinda is a caricature, not allowed to stray too far from her original joke. Dr. Girlfriend is a character allowed to live and thrive as a human and as a woman. The Venture Brothers isn't perfect and doesn't always get things right, though. I'll be far from the first to complain about Ned, the retarded parody version of the Thing from Fantastic Four.
Don't know word! Yes, it is, Neddy.
It's a little weird that I feel Ned was handled poorly, because this show has tons of disfigured or otherwise disabled characters living life either as disabled people or as failed science experiments. Billy Quizboy is a little person that has trouble interacting with a lot of things intended for taller people. Hank is... Hank?
My pants are haunted! My pants are haunted!
I'm out of gun food!
Aren't you just a little ashamed of your ignorance?
Like just a little?
Yeah, constantly. What do you want, a rag?
Honestly, Hank, where do you pick that stuff up? I never see you read.
It's weird, right?
It's like he channels dead crazy people.
But Ned, unlike these characters, is a walking helmet and crayons joke. On my first watch of the show, he was really painful to sit through, though I minded less on subsequent watches. I'm not exactly skipping the episodes Ned has a big part in. The group Ned is in is another really clever use of parody. It sounds like The Impossible Family would be the sort of parody I complained about earlier, where they just put their characters in one-to-one scenarios, but instead of playing out the exact story of the Fantastic Four with zany meta-commentary, the parody is in just how different their stories are. The gimmick of The Impossible Family is that 3 of the 4 members were disfigured and left worse off in the mutation. But Mr. Impossible got cool stretchy powers. He treats his family horribly, hiding Ned, psychologically abusing his wife, and, well...
Sir, thanks to this little dynamo, Impossible Industries is 100% green.
And you didn't think you had it in you to be a supervillain.
Earlier, I mentioned that the Monarch was not supposed to be a regularly occurring character. If you've seen the series but aren't read up on the bonus materials, this might be quite the surprise to you, because, boy, is the Monarch important. Instead, Baron Underbite was supposed to be the main bad guy, but unfortunately he's so evil in a tangible way that he's only usable in small chunks. The Monarch, however, has this try-hard attitude. He's far from harmless. He has a very impressive body count and successfully kills guys in much higher standing than himself, but his feud with Dr. Venture is so cartoonish, so removed from reality, that he immediately becomes a much better thorn in Dr. Venture's side. A real threat, one that ultimately kills the Venture Boys, while at the same time very grounded and focused, where Baron Underbite has to split his focus between arching Dr. Venture and running his fascist regime. It's rare that a show gives the villain the sort of focus the Venture Brothers gives the Monarch, without somehow redeeming that character out of its evil shell. The Monarch is just evil. He always will be, and even if the movie somehow makes him and Dr. Venture on okay terms, there's no way it just make him not evil. He lives and breathes the stuff. This isn't Megamind, some soft-hearted dork who happened into villainy. This is the Monarch. He chose the life he has, just as he chose to love Dr. Girlfriend, and he regularly breaks rules and promises to maintain that lifestyle. He's an unredeemable villain, not because he killed a bunch of people, but because he will not be redeemed. You might have noticed that I've done a lot of talking about other shows so far. To explain why, I'd like to go back to Smiling Friends. But before I talk about Smiling Friends again, I need to talk about the romance book genre. And before I do that, I want to talk more about the Venture Brothers. In the art book Go Team Venture, the writers expressed that they took inspiration often from things they either saw as kids or random things that happened to them. For instance, there's an episode where Dean gets testicular torsion. This episode is actually really important to the continuity of the show. It's the first episode in which the Guild of Calamitous Intent cucks and arching, and it's also the first time we really see Billy and White, the characters that will become very important later on. It's worth mentioning that Billy and White did show up in the pilot episode, but they seemed more like background characters. I don't think they were anything more than the voices and designs at that point. I bring up this episode because the writers said this episode was a very direct way of them letting random stuff leach into the show. This happens to Dean because it happened to one of the writers. It's an embarrassing thing to happen, and it's interesting to decide how this world of cartoon heroism and villainy react to this real medical emergency. Those things seem completely unrelated, but they do bounce off of each other. Through this, we see a guild bylaw allowing arches to seek medical attention uninterrupted. We meet Billy and White and learn their whole deal, and we even learn that the guild bylaw is called Rusty's Law, our first insinuation about Dr. Venture's boy adventuring past having long-reaching consequences in this world's politics. In contrast to this backboarding of experience and world interaction is the romance genre as far as it goes with books. Romance is, of course, diverse, with tons of different works by tons of different authors with tons of different backgrounds. But when I say the romance community, I'm not referring to just any romance community, but instead a particular online community that is very tight-knit, very cutthroat, and pretty much the first community that Twitter authors start muting and blocking like crazy. This romance community is very, very set in its ways and tropes. Challenging those tropes, such as not having a happy ending, is not just met with accusations of not being romance, but with review bombs and actual hate campaigns. By the way, by happy ending, I don't even mean the characters are alive at the end. I mean, I've seen authors review bombed for not having the relationship be permanent because the romance community is that dead set on HEAs being the best possible outcome for the characters, and also something that you are morally wrong to not have. Hell, one time I got kicked out of a romance anthology because the love interest was fat, and falling in love with a fat guy is apparently not a heavily ever after? I thought this was a joke, until I was actually kicked out, because like, what? I don't just mean to attack the romance community, I'm not trying to get doxxed here. What I'm saying is that the book genre of romance is a very incestuous place. Things happen in these books purely because that's the way things happen in romance. Don't get me wrong, generic romance has a massive audience, and Brickleberry got 3 seasons. But unlike Brickleberry, whose only sin is that I kinda don't care for it, this community has this attitude that if you're not doing it the way everyone else is doing it, then you're doing it wrong, and that makes you a bad person. If you write romance, you should read romance and nothing but romance. You should live and breathe the tropes. Don't take advice from things outside of the domain of romance, and you should never ever associate with someone that claims they're doing romance, but their thing doesn't look like our thing. If you let something else bleed into your romance, your lack of rejection for fat people or a splitting of ways, then you have deceived your audience. But then let's look at Smiling Friends. Comedy, in contrast to romance, is partially caused by the unexpected. If you anticipate a joke, you might not laugh as hard. You can lean really hard into this XD random, or you can lean out of it and make it dry, but most works are going to try to do both. In this pilot episode, the boss says, "You don't mind if someone eats, do you?" This sets up an expectation that he just wants to snack on some crisps during the scene, but then he immediately does this. This joke is set up so it's not random, that bean was there the whole time. And the boss did specifically say someone, rather than asking if he could eat. But also, you can't really have predicted that that was what was going to happen. This element of surprise makes it so comedy is almost impossible to do without a lot of outside influence. You can look in other comedy shows and pull from there, and in honesty, you should. You should be literate in your genre, but you shouldn't just pull from there. If you really want your comedy to work in a memorable way, it should incorporate tropes you've learned from other things. South Park loves to talk about the world. Since it's a rare example of an animated show that can be done in under a year, in fact often being done in under a week, it uses that freshness as its starting point. Every episode is topical about whatever Trey Parker and company are thinking about. Smiling Friends is a little more diverse than that. It takes longer to animate, so it never could have gone the South Park route, at least not as hard as South Park does. But I don't think it would have anyway. With no art book out, and as of writing this only 9 episodes, it's a bit hard to talk about what Smiling Friend does get its inspiration from. But we can see some of it from the surface. The sequence where Pym is outrunning the forest demon is genuinely terrifying and clearly comes from somewhere. The Salties episode starts with a dig at fast food joints going healthy. Satan angrily corrects Happy Holidays into Merry Christmas, and multiple scenes within it feel heavily taken out of something else and then reapplied in the context of the Smiling Friends world. Again, Smiling Friends doesn't just do this because it's a parody, because they reference a thing. It actually recontextualizes the thing it parodies. When Mustard is playing a noir femme fatale, Charlie doesn't act like a noir protagonist who's both tempted and rejecting her, but instead he's just responding to her in his normal way, saying, well, yeah, everyone loves fun, but, get off of me. But as well as Smiling Friends handles inspiration, I don't think any show will ever handle inspiration the way the Venture Brothers does. Venture Bros doesn't just draw from other TV shows or from reality, though it does both of those things. It draws from music. It draws from Mara fucking Angelou. Yes, it is first and foremost a parody of boy adventures, but it's also this incredibly well-read, well-rounded piece of media where you can see all these weird geek interests bleeding into the corners. Whether it's 21 and 24 arguing about the Smurfs, most of the guild being named after David Bowie stuff, or the monarch giving an ill-fated scared straight monologue, The Venture Brothers isn't just a comedic TV show, it is a collage of experience recontextualized into a thriving and breathing world.